Welcome, everyone, to Social Science 101 for Animal Law Attorneys. I am very pleased to be here with our wonderful speakers, Lori Marino, who's the director of the Camilla Center for Scholarship-Based Animal Advocacy and the president of the Whale Sanctuary Project. And she's also co-director with me of the Animal Law and Science Project here at GW. And we also have the wonderful Joe Anderson, who is the research director at Faunalytics and an adjunct research professor at Carleton University. And I'm Kathy Hessler, the Assistant Dean of the Animal Law Program here at GW and co-director of the Animal Law and Science Project with Lori. So today we're going to talk about animal law and social science, but it's part of a larger conversation that we're having within our Animal Law and Science Project. We're doing webinars that are trying to address the intersection of law, natural science, and social science, because we think lawyers need to be learning from the scientists and scientists need to be learning from the lawyers, and we all need to be doing a better job working together. So that's part of the goals. So the first iteration, if you will, of our work are these 101 series. And so they're designed to give a high-level overview of law and science so that people can enter the conversation wherever they're at and learn from it. And then we're going to be doing deeper dive webinars next year, things like maybe sentience, and then we'll spend the whole webinar and things like that. So today we're going to be doing this sort of high-level overview information. We're also going to be talking about social science a little bit more broadly, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I just want to also mention that the Animal Law and Science Project has a number of other things that we're doing. And so we have, we've had early support from the Brooks Institute for the Animal Rights Law and Policy, which was great, and they supported a summit to help us get going. We also have a website, we have a listserv. We're working with the National Commission for Research Ethics with Phoenix Zones and Dr. Hope Ferdowsian, trying to get animals included into research ethics more broadly and out of research more hopefully. We have recordings from all our events, including these events, and we also have an Animals and AI series we're doing with Yolanda Eisenstein and UIAA. So that's more generally what we're doing, but focusing on what we're doing today, our Social Science 101 goals. We want to help legal advocates in whatever framework they're in develop a better scientific literacy, right? Just understanding terms and concepts and being able to use them appropriately and accurately. And this, again, is a conversation starter, right? It's just the beginning to help people know about the field and that there's more to learn and maybe where to learn those kinds of things and to avoid pitfalls, right? So there's some really big things that we get wrong as lawyers when we're talking about science. And so if we can try to figure out what those are and avoid those pitfalls, that would be great. How to work together effectively, right? Lawyers navigating scientific issues and settings and how science is useful when and how to use it, and concepts versus content, right? So again, we're going to be doing large concepts and not tons of in-depth content here, but we'll do more of that later. So we're going to today focus on what is social science, what should legal advocates care, why should they care about social science, how can social science be employed in the law, and how human psychology impacts animal advocacy efforts. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joe.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks for being here, everyone. So first of all, as Kathy mentioned, we're going to talk about what is social science. So I myself am a social psychologist, but social science encompasses far more than just that one field. Next slide, please. And when we think about social science, one of those misconceptions that Kathy touched on briefly is the idea that it is a soft science, or not a real science compared to the natural sciences, the physical sciences. Obviously, I'm in the position of being a social scientist, so take this for what you will, but in my opinion, that's not just incorrect, but actually almost backward. In a way, social science is harder than natural science in the sense of difficulty. When you drop a ball, you can be pretty sure that it's going to fall to earth 10 times out of 10. Whereas if you put a person in a room hungry with a plate of delicious cookies, there's a lot more going on that might influence whether they're going to eat those cookies or not, which makes it much harder to study makes it more difficult to draw strong conclusions. And I think those lack of strong conclusions sometimes are what lead to the perception of it being a softer science. But as a result of that, the rigor that needs to go into designing studies and having enough sample and repeating enough times to draw strong conclusions leads to a particular emphasis when this is done well on using the scientific method, on following a systematic approach and being really sure that the conclusions you're drawing are justifiable by seeing the same thing happening again and again enough times to be able to say, this is a thing that occurs in the world. So there is a basis behind it of evidence, of critical thinking, of reasoning that is crucial and fundamental to social science just as much as there is with natural sciences. Next slide, please. And what can we do with this? So this is drawing on a graphic just as an example from Phonalytics website. This is a piece of our theory of change, but it applies more broadly. It applies to animal advocacy in general and social science in general. The idea that you can use social science and the things we can do with it to empower animal advocates, including attorneys, including all kinds of animal advocates who are working to create change for animals in myriad different ways. Social science can be used to analyze different strategies, to conduct research into what we already know, where the gaps are in what we know, so that we know how to proceed and continue and try to learn more, and to maximize the effectiveness of strategies that we're already using. So looking at the green boxes, these are just some of the different ways that we can create change for animals, and any one of those ways can be studied using one or probably multiple forms of social science to learn more and inform our actions. Thank you. So here is an overview of some areas of social science. The list is a little bit fuzzy, especially toward the bottom. Sometimes people talk about linguistics or history, or archaeology being more of a humanities. I like thinking of them in terms of social science because they, like the things near the top of the list, psychology, economics, sociology, can be studied rigorously, systematically, and theories created and then tested. And that is what's at the root of any science. So all of these, I am not an expert in most of them, to be clear, but all of these can be really strong forms of science that we can use to inform, test, analyze, and come up with new ways of helping animals. So I want to go into each of these in a little bit more detail because one of the things that I think can be a challenge for people who are not part of a discipline is just knowing what it is. And I say that as someone who is obviously not part of all of those disciplines I just listed. Anyone who is part of these may take issue with some of the simplicity that I'm using for these definitions, but I find them a helpful way to encapsulate each of these types of social science. So first, psychology, where I'm coming from, essentially boils down to why individuals think and behave as they do. So for instance, in terms of the type of work that we do, why people tend to love dogs but eat pigs, even though both animals are actually relatively similar in terms of their behavior and personalities and intelligence. Economics, it's not all about money. So what comes to mind, of course, is money, wealth, the transfer thereof, but I actually find it more useful myself to think of it in terms of how things are made, moved around, and used. And to get into what that means, let me give you an example. So soybeans are grown in Brazil, something being made, produced. They are used to feed fish in China. And then those fish from China are ultimately eaten by US consumers. So there's this supply chain that is global, interconnected, and problematic from my perspective and probably many of yours. But that is all economics. It's the process of thing A getting to place B, coming to the people in place C, why that's happening, the structures behind it, and understanding that is part of how we approach changing it. Sociology, people sometimes mix this up a little bit with psychology because there's a fuzzy boundary between the two. So whereas psychology focuses on individuals, often in the context of the groups they're part of, so myself in relation to other psychologists, for instance, sociology really focuses on the group and large group level. So how human social systems operate, how they change over time, and how they relate to each other, those systems. So examples of that are things like why unemployment occurs, why it's at the level it's at, the existence of food deserts and how they influence people, or systemic racism are all examples of things that you can study using sociology. Political science. This one's a little easier. It's kind of right on the tin, but it's almost like psychology of politics. There's more to it than that, but essentially why political entities, including government, voters, countries even, act as they do and what they're doing. So here you could think about whether people will vote for a candidate who talks about animal welfare in their platform, what influences those sorts of decisions, and how politicians think about these issues, like what goes into the things that they say and are willing to sign on for regarding animals. It's all part of poli-sci. Anthropology, I think, and this is just my opinion, is probably not as directly related to a lot of the work that we do, but is the idea of what are humans? Who are humans? How did human culture evolve? What are its features? How did they develop? Obviously, a huge and important question. And some of the ways that it can overlap more with animal advocacy and our interests is studying things like how humans' relationships with animals might have emerged, how they differ by culture, how they developed, why we see differences between food animals and companion animals in terms of how we relate to them, all of those sorts of things. And archaeology, I'm sure you're familiar with, but is the idea of studying past peoples through material remains, so things left behind. There's a decent amount of overlap between archaeology and anthropology, but the focus of archaeology is really on those material remains. So perhaps looking at things left behind by ancient societies that might give us a hint into these people had companion animals, for instance. We can see that in the things that they left behind. Linguistics, which also has a special place in my heart. I did a minor in that, not that you asked. And it is the study of language from a social, cognitive, or physiological standpoint. In terms of animal issues, we might think about this in terms of the social primarily. What are the words we use? And what do they mean when we're talking about animals? And I think Laurie's going to touch on that a bit later, so I will leave that part for her. But there's lots of great things that we can learn through the study of linguistics. And finally, history. Again, kind of straddling that border between social science and humanities, but history is something where you can look at past events and really try to dig in systematically, critically, to understand why they occurred. So an example I like here is looking at movements that share some sort of similarity with animal rights, animal welfare, and trying to understand why things like the civil rights movement or the women's suffrage movement, why they succeeded, where they had challenges, where they did well, and seeing if there are any lessons we can draw from things like that to understand why they occurred and whether any of that could be replicated or changed in some way to suit the needs of animal rights activists. So that is a quick overview of different types of social science, and I will turn it back over to Kathy to talk a little bit about the legal perspective.
Meeting. Okay, thanks, Joe. That was great. So just moving there. Okay. We'll talk a little bit about how that intersects with the work that advocates are doing and why they should care. So we think it's important that folks understand that these areas, these domains, law and science, they need each other and they inform each other. Right? So law is a process of making decisions, right? And setting up guidelines and foundational principles, that sort of thing. But it doesn't by itself have inherent expertise in all the domains that it's working in, right? So judges don't know who's the best parent for a child. They need information about that. They don't also know, for instance, what the harm is when a calf is removed from his or her mother, right? So they need experts, they need the science to help us understand that. And one of the things that's great about this conversation is letting people know there's a conversation to be had, right? So it's not just the physiological harms that we're concerned about when we're talking about animal protection, but it's these emotional and cognitive and psychological and social harms that we need to be aware of as well. And that's so the decision making is the domain of the law, but the information gathering and assessment we need from the experts in the scientific realm. So we need each other. These groups also don't all understand each other particularly well. And so we use information incorrectly all the time. I see lawyers, and I, in my early days, certainly was guilty of this as well. I would say, oh, this study says X. And so therefore, I'm going to use it to support my proposition Y, right? But I was overstating or oversimplifying the information that was in that particular study. And so I was incorrectly using it. And I didn't fully understand in my early use of science that the evidentiary sort of standards are different, right, for scientists and for lawyers. So all I need for in the law is like, here's some evidence and that's enough to prove my case. Whereas scientist needs lots of evidence and needs to acknowledge where there are questions or concerns or things aren't settled. And that's important in the scientific model and process, but it's not particularly helpful, right, when I want to use that data in the legal model. So we get it incorrect a lot of the times. And we also therefore create sort of limitations on how we understand those domains. The law also regulates the scientific domain in some ways, right? And it certainly as to what can come into the legal domain, it certainly regulates that. So good science, as we understand it, will make law better, because I also see people relying on poor science, poor data, and because they think it will support their advocacy, rather than actually saying, no, like, honestly, this is not, it doesn't say all the things I wanted to say. Here's where there's still some lack of determinate, lack of, things are uncertain, right? Things are indeterminate. So those are the cases that are going to get overturned later on, right? If we're using bad science, and they'll inculcate, if you will, misunderstandings of science in our work. And so that's really problematic, and it takes a lot of effort to undo that later on. So it's important, if we can, to get the science right at the beginning and to understand what that's going to take. Okay, so in doing so, right, that has a lot of benefits for our work, our legal advocacy. It's helpful when we stay current about the latest research and we're aware of conflicting data and we're honest about conflicting data. And we can say, we think this data, right, represents the reality, but there are conflicts and we have to sort of address what that looks like. Our work, I think, will be taken more seriously and it will be less overturned if we do that. Understanding the impact of different studies and findings is challenging for us as lawyers, as people trained in the law. And so we need some help from our scientist colleagues to actually understand what these things mean and then therefore how to talk about them. When we do that, that will improve our advocacy, right? Our materials, our strategies, our techniques, our approaches. And I think one thing we want to emphasize too is that understanding all of this and doing it early days, whether it's in a litigation case or a legislative strategy or a public campaign, understanding this stuff in the early days as we're developing those strategic approaches is really, really important, because we'll get it right earlier and we'll have to deviate less. So as lawyers and legal advocates, we don't know what we don't know, and we need to have some humility and awareness of that. And because we don't have typically training in social or natural sciences, we need to seek assistance to try and figure out what it is that we don't know and how to use that. right? So we're trained to look within the legal system for all the evidence, support, and guidance that we need, right? Generally speaking, but we know that we need to go beyond that. So learning what kind of data exists, learning what kind of resources exist is going to be helpful. So learning about the information is the first step, and then using it is the next step. So there are places to get help, and we can use it across the board in the work that we do. And so I'll turn it back over to Joe to help us learn how to do that.
Okay, thank you. So yes, how can social science be employed in the law? And I first just want to second what Kathy was saying about neither side fully understands the other. Without training in the law, I am very much in the position of relying on helpful, friendly colleagues like Kathy and Lori to walk me through things. Um, and I talk about things wrong from the legal perspective. I use the wrong words, wrong terminology, but we collaborate and can reach mutual understanding that way. So that's why I think things like this are so important.
I want to say I'm not a lawyer.
Oh, apologies. But yes, so if you could go to the next slide, please. Just to address that piece of starting by looking for information, where to find things, what exists out there. Again, a big piece of what I don't know about law is just what it actually looks like. Like what are lawyers doing? What is the difference between one type of lawyer and another? All of those things are things that I've had to learn slowly from individuals who are kind enough to teach me about it. And what I'm hoping with this is that we can give you a little bit of insight into some of the social science that exists. So the slide that's up right now is meant to be a sneak peek, just a tiny tip of the iceberg example of some of the types of research that do exist that can be used by animal law attorneys and other types of advocates as well. With the hope that you can take this and kind of see the bigger, more general picture of the types of work that can be done and start thinking about other things that might be useful to you in your work. So what you'll see here, these are examples from Faunalytics, which I am most familiar with, of course, but there are a range of different groups and academics doing research on topics like this that I'll touch on a little bit later. So for now, on the left side of the screen, you can see 3 studies from the last couple of years that Faunalytics has done that speak directly to some of those intersections between law and animals and social science. The first one, Local Action for Animals, was a study that we conducted with the support of a second-year law student, looking at how municipal level legislation or non-binding resolutions or really anything along those lines on various animal topics seemed to have influenced in some way state level change, or at least the spread of municipal level change. So we looked into case law history and looked for evidence in the decisions or the outcomes of different bills to see what had happened, whether others had occurred afterward, whether they referenced previous similar examples from surrounding municipalities, trying to bring together the skill sets of social science and a law student to draw some sort of conclusions about whether pursuing action at a municipal level seems to be effective in terms of spreading things, spreading change for animals. And short answer, yes, we believe that it is. Probably not surprising to you if you work in this space, but having that support from the scientific side can be really helpful for informing the type of work that you do, or where you focus your energy, or where you focus your money, because it's always, to some extent, a zero-sum game in terms of funding. There's always something else you could be doing. So that's why we undertake studies like that sometimes. The others that we have there are a little more indirect, not about the type of work that you necessarily would choose to take on as a lawyer versus not. More information that could support work that you might be doing. So in the second one, Jurors' Reflections, we looked at transcripts of interviews with jurors from the Smithfield Piglet trial and pulled out themes in terms of what the jurors talked about and how they saw the case, how it affected them, and made some recommendations about how both advocates and lawyers, legal advocates, can think about jurors in this sort of situation, because it's not super common for just regular people who are thrown into a jury to be confronted with the kind of animal rights presentation and information in that context over such a long period of time. Like, they might see a video once in a while online otherwise, but it's a different thing to be in a jury box and to be confronted with this information throughout a trial. So understanding more about how they saw that process and how it influenced them and their own decisions can be really useful and interesting. And third, excuse me. And third, this was a fairly basic study, support for farmed animal welfare legislation in 10 key US states. So this is exactly what it sounds like. We did polling in 10 US states that were identified as particularly ripe potentially for legislative change, and polled constituents there to see what their support was for a variety of different potential animal welfare laws, from relatively minimal to larger changes. And that kind of data is fairly easy to collect, and is something that, if you're at the stage in your work where you're trying to decide where to focus an effort or what specific type of effort to focus on, like what should the text of the bill be that you're trying to put forward with the ballot measure, something like that can really help inform what you're doing if you do it before you begin. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, I just wanted to highlight a few of the great many wide range of studies that exist in the world that were not conducted by Faunalytics. So these are all ones that we have in our Faunalytics library, and I included the link at the bottom. But the distinction here is the ones on the left are ones that we ran ourselves. The ones on the right are part of this library where we just catalog and summarize, make more accessible the huge amount of research that exists, a lot of it academic, some of it from other nonprofit organizations, but all of it useful to animal advocates, including animal attorneys, in the work that you're doing. So things like the impact of intensive farming on the spread of zoonotic disease can be incredibly useful for supporting some sort of case along those lines. Understanding human interactions with wild animals in an urban environment is another example. If you're getting into some sort of litigation in a city, for instance, we have something about corporations and transparency around the promises that they make and when they break those promises. And these are just 4 examples. We have over 5,000 articles in our library that are summaries of the wide world of research that exists out there from social scientists. So this isn't a pitch for Faunalytics. It is a pitch for social science, and we make some of that accessible to advocates and attorneys among them. And I do truly believe that there's a lot out there that can be very useful. Oh, next slide, please. So that was question 1, is where do you find this kind of research? Question 2 is, what do you do with it once you found it? And there are a number of questions here on this slide that might help guide that conversation or that line of thought, but I'm going to actually go straight to the last one first. Get help answering these questions and remember to ask them. So let's circle back to the beginning, but as we do that, just bear in mind that nobody is an expert on everything, and that, at least from my perspective, I think that many social scientists would be really happy to talk to someone who doesn't quite know what they're asking, but wants to make it useful in their real world work. Like that is the dream. Doing research and having someone use it to make a difference. That's why we're doing what we're doing. So yes, starting from the last point on the slide, but the first point in my head is get help with this. Work on it together with researchers, with social scientists, whenever you can. So yes, in terms of looking at research yourself on your own, you can look for things like conflict of interest in terms of who did the research. Generally speaking, people will disclose funding, or at least should disclose funding, whether it comes from industry, for instance. I actually had another example article on the previous slide about industry funded research and the bias that comes with that. You can also look for other types of bias in the research. This can be anything about the person's background or the way that they have framed the question. So if you get the sense that the researcher conducting the research is associated with industry, there can be hallmarks of that in the introduction to the report in the way that it's framed, not talking about animal issues in terms of harm to animals, but in terms of harm to farmers exclusively, harm to profit, all of those sorts of things. It doesn't necessarily mean that the research is going to be bad, but it at least makes you think a little bit more about whether they're considering all perspectives on the work. The next is peer review. So probably something that most of you are familiar with in the general sense, but there are degrees of familiarity with it. So this is the idea of in academia, typically in academia, when you write up a research finding, you might put one or more studies into a professionally written report and submit it to an academic journal. So once you've done that, the editor of the journal will do a first pass and occasionally do a rejection right away if it's particularly not a good fit. But otherwise, the usual thing is that the editor would then send out your submission to a set of reviewers who are peers, essentially. So me submitting as a social psychologist, if I submitted something about animals, they would attempt to find other social psychologists who work in this general space of animals and human relationships. Those people then are meant to do an impartial third-party review to say whether the science is good, whether the way that you've designed the studies is solid, the conclusions you've drawn are supported by the data, all of that. So there are a lot of flaws in the peer review system and academia in general. This is not a perfect system. Egos come into it, and drive to publish as much as you can to make money comes into it. It is a flawed system, but it is also a decent way of getting a sense that the science is probably pretty good, in the sense that it's usually better to have other experts look something over than not, even despite those flaws. And so seeing whether an article that you're looking at or the findings you're looking at come from a peer-reviewed source can be evidence that it is strong science. Are the findings based on anecdote or systematic objective analysis? What this comes down to is essentially, is this science or is it a story? So if you're looking at something like a peer-reviewed journal, you're not going to find something anecdotal in there. But if you're looking more broadly, like just doing Google searches to try and find something to support your claim, it is really important to look for whether something seems like anecdote or a systematic observation of a research question from a neutral perspective. So a really good example of this is at Phonalytics, because our goal is to put out research that helps advocates in the work that they're doing, not to have a strong academic career, to progress to get tenure at a university. We don't put any emphasis really on achieving peer-reviewed publications because they take a lot of time. As a result, you can't use that third point to judge our work based on like whether it's peer-reviewed, whether it is strong enough to be considered good. So instead, what you would be looking for is this a systematic research approach? Is it following the scientific method? And in our case, we pre-register our study designs before we ever collect data, before we ever analyze them, which kind of shows that we have done the due diligence beforehand to lay out, here's the exact approach that we're taking. It is systematic, it is objective. We're eliminating bias in this, and this way. And then when we come later to put out the findings, we can refer back to that and also sort of show our work, show that we haven't moved the goalposts between when we started and when we're publishing. So things like that can also be really helpful. Otherwise, does the interpretation reflect the data? This is something where if you aren't digging into the data yourself, it might be a little bit hard to judge, but especially if you're looking across multiple studies of a similar type to try and make a case or support a case, you'll start to notice patterns. Like the interpretation should probably not be, as Kathy alluded to earlier, should probably never be, this proves definitively that something is true. That rarely happens in science. It may need to happen in the courtroom, but in scientific literature, you will generally find more nuance. And if you're not seeing that nuance, or people talking about limitations of their work, then that actually can be a little bit of a red flag. So look out for that kind of thing. And cherry picking, of course, is also an issue. That it can be something that is easy to do. I'm not saying for lawyers in particular, it can be easy for anyone to do. When you have a point that you want to make and you believe is true, you tend to search for articles or data that supports that, and might deliberately or accidentally overlook other findings that add that type of nuance I'm talking about. It is quite rare that all data points specifically in the same direction, that you have a North Star of truth. Usually there will be some degree of disagreement between studies, and it doesn't mean that you can't give a strong recommendation or a strong statement, but you rarely want to be relying on a single study for your points, and should be a little bit suspicious if someone is doing that without ever referencing any other literature. And again, just because that is a lot, coming back to this point of getting help answering these questions and working through it together with people who are expert in this and are motivated to help. So just touching on one piece of this a little bit more, I was talking about research in general, social science in general, but there are a few sources of bias in animal advocacy research in particular that it is worth looking out for. We need to be as critical of ourselves as everyone else. So thinking about animal advocacy research, a few things that we see, and this is all elaborated on in the report that's noted at the bottom of the slide, by the way. First, the idea that companion animals, pets, cats and dogs in particular, tend to be really emphasized in research. It's where people start a lot of the time in their thinking about animal welfare, animal issues. And it makes sense. We love animals that we grow up with, that we spend our time around, but it can lead to this overrepresentation of cat and dog issues in research as well, ignoring or downplaying the impact of similar issues on farmed animals, for instance, or animals used in science. Again, conflicts of interest. I mentioned it in terms of industry earlier, but it can also be an issue in animal advocacy research. So in this case, maybe you see an animal food company sponsoring a study and showing that the number of companion animals in the country has skyrocketed. You need to think about whether there's any reason that that could have occurred other than it being full truth. Is there anything that could be going on under the hood there in terms of conflict of interest? And finally, scholarly infighting. This is true in any domain. and really any human society, there's going to be differences of opinion and strong ones. And you will see sometimes academics or scholars behaving in ways that are more of the adversarial courtroom approach, less of the scholarly approach, when really we're meant to be neutral, to think about different theories and change our theories if they aren't supported by data. That doesn't always play out as nicely as it would in the ideal world. So taking one piece of work out of context of the entire body of literature on a question can sometimes lead you to the opinion that a certain thing is definitively true, when in fact it is one very strong-minded person who believes wholeheartedly that that is true, but there are other experts out there who would disagree. So that essentially is a specific type of cherry picking that it can occur. And again, it's not unique to animal advocacy research in any way, but is something to watch for. So working with social scientists, where do I find them? What do I ask them for? A couple of things to think about, first of all, and then I'll give you some specific examples. It's great to choose people who do try to be that objective, ideal scholar, even though it can be frustrating. I know that frustration, having worked closely with that law student previously, that we don't quite speak the same language. There's a desire to prove versus a desire to be neutral. But you do, when you're talking to a scientist, want to try and find someone who is going to be neutral, not say more than the data says. It's up to you to do any additional work that needs to be done in order to make it sell, essentially. The scientist should present it to you as neutrally as possible. And also people who similarly consider and are transparent about what the findings say, what they don't say, not overextending. And as promised, I did want to give you some specific examples. So the top row here are groups that explicitly work on the junction between research and advocates. So none of these are specific, excuse me, to animal attorneys, but they are all about the idea of researchers working together with advocates, whether that's attorneys or any other type of advocate. Faunalytics, of course, my organization is one. And we have things like pro bono office hours where you can come and talk to us about all of those things that were on the previous slide. We have researchers who can chat through all of those issues and help you find things. The Fair Society focuses primarily on psychology and how that interacts with advocacy, and they're all about that conjunction. And the Tiny Beam Fund funds research that is about the intersection of research and advocacy as well, and helps make those partnerships happen. And then the bottom row is just a few examples of other ways that some of these bridges are being built between advocacy and research. Definitely not a definitive list, but some of the nonprofit and animal studies programs that exists in the world, just so that you're kind of aware that these things are out there. And again, somewhere like Faunalytics would be happy to help connect you with groups like this if there's a particular one that could be useful. So yes, social scientists exist. We are accessible, even if it seems like there's a big barrier. And I think in most cases would be happy to help.
So, thank you. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Kathy. Before we get to some questions, which you can pose in the Q&A, I want to turn briefly to sort of a slightly different dimension of this, which is the fact that everything we do in animal law has to do with the fact that we are dealing with our own species and all the things that our own species brings to the table in terms of our psychology. So the question is, how does human psychology impact animal advocacy efforts? And it's really important to understand human psychology because it impacts how well we do in litigation, legislation, policy making, etc. Some of the important questions are, how do people think about themselves in relation to animals? And what assumptions do people make about animals? When you're going into a courtroom, you're faced with some individuals. What assumptions are they making about the animals that you might be representing? What concepts are difficult for people to accept and why? What's the psychology behind that? What terms are triggering for people? What terms can you use that may not trigger as much of a response as some others? And to just understand what's behind that. How do judges make decisions? Boy, there's a whole, you walk into a court and you're faced with a judge and you're making an argument. You need to know something about who that judge is, not only individually, but as a human being, and what kinds of psychology come into play when she or he are making decisions based upon the data that you're presenting to them. How do legislators make decisions? That's another whole psychological realm. And what methods of communication yield desired results? So those are just a few of the important high-level questions that we need to ask about human psychology that are relevant to animal law. Some of the really important aspects of this, and I'll just briefly touch upon. One is human exceptionalism and speciesism. We come into a situation with assumptions about who we are as a species and how we relate to other species. And most people, despite their protestations, even in 2024, believe that humans are somehow above other animals, qualitatively different from other species, and are greater in moral value than all other species. And we have the scala natura in our heads that assumes human superiority. That assumption leads to animal abuse and exploitation, and is really a form of implicit bias and prejudice. And a lot of studies have shown that speciesism is very much like other forms of human prejudice when it comes to the psychological underpinnings. A lot of this is driven by our propensity to view issues from an in-group, out-group perspective. So just knowing that when you're walking into a court, you're already walking into a situation steeped in human exceptionalism and speciesism. So that's your starting point. Next. And in terms of communication and language, I know Joe mentioned this, linguistics, it's so important. There are so many ways that language not only reflects our thinking, but shapes our thinking. There are so many biased terms that support speciesist attitudes and abusive behaviors. Of course, the one we know we see the most frequently is it, referring to other animals as it instead of who, or he, she, they, which totally objectifies the animal. There are hierarchical terms that don't reflect anything about real biology, higher versus lower animals. When you hear that, you think of a hierarchy or a scala natura, but that doesn't conform to anything we know about biological evolution. There are dismissive terms like they're just animals. And when you hear about that, that comes loaded with all kinds of assumptions. Labels by use. Rats are lab animals. Chickens are farm animals. Labeling them according to how they're exploited instead of really seeing the animal for who he or she is. And there are distancing terms for the same human and non-human behavior. As a scientist, I had to deal with this all the time. Instead of saying, well, this lion is being affectionate with her cub, you have to say she is displaying affiliative behavior. you have to say affective instead of emotional. And behaviors that refer to things that we all have in common, like grief, are always referred to as grief-like. And so all of these terms distance human psychology from non-human psychology and serve to promote human exceptionalism. Next slide, please. More biased terms. In laboratories, you may hear somebody say, well, we euthanized or sacrificed the monkeys. In fact, they killed them. And that's important to own that if that's in fact what you did. Euthanasia is not what happens in labs. Zoos will refer to the place where they keep the animals as habitats or environments instead of a cage or a display, in an effort to shape the psychology of the people who come and visit the animals. They'll talk about acquiring instead of trapping or capture. They'll talk about harvesting for collecting body parts and tissues. And they will also say things like in human care instead of captivity. Oh, the elephants are in human care, instead of the fact that they're holding the elephants captive. And all of these terms, these linguistic terms of phrase, serve to reflect and shape psychology in whatever way one wants to bend it. Next slide. So that is just a very, very brief review of some of the ways that human psychology and understanding it is so important to what is being done in animal legal advocacy and other aspects of advocacy. Questions going forward that we are going to be engaged with in the Animal Law and Science program are questions like, what do lawyers need to know about social science? What changes should occur within educational, legal, and scientific institutions? What should we study? What resources and expertise already exist? And as Joe said, find those early on. What are the barriers to effective collaboration? What types of learning opportunities are available for lawyers and scientists, both in and out of academia? And how can animal interests be added and served? What types of critical lenses should be incorporated? What would make critical dialogue and analysis most effective? And what resources would be helpful? And Kathy and I are hoping that our project at GW in Animal Law and Science will answer some of those questions or respond to some of those important questions in animal law. So we will be adding resources on our website, and we want to hear from you. What do you want to see as an animal advocate or a lawyer? We'll also obviously be posting these slides and the webinar recording on the Animal Law and Science Project section of the Animal Legal Education Initiative site on GW Law, as we did with the first two. So we want to thank you. I think that's what we have for slides. We want to thank you so much, and we'll take any questions that you might have.
And it looks like we have a couple questions in the Q&A. So someone mentioned the law enforcement personnel and internet commentators or commenters referring to violent criminals as animals. So that's really common and very problematic. I don't know, Lori and Joe, if you wanted to add to that.
Well, I think, what that does is, I mean, we are animals biologically, but that's not what's meant when we call a human being an animal. What we're trying to say is that they're not civilized, that they are more like they're below us. And that reflects the fact that that's how we think of other animals, as below us, as, not able to manage their own behavior. And so it's a put down not only of the person, of the violent criminal, but it's a put down of all animals as well.
Joe, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
I think I would just echo what Lori said. I think that terminology like that has historically been used across groups to put down marginalized groups. But the knock-on effect of that is that it's putting down non-human animals at the same time. Essentially, anytime language like that is used, it is being used to harm, whether that's animals or other humans. It's minimizing real issues that exist in our society and equating one thing to another where there is no actual comparison.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it makes it more challenging to undo this invisible and unrealistic species divide, right? So I think the more that we can understand that humans are actually animals and a part and cousins, right, to all the other animals, the more we can see our similarities rather than just the differences. And yeah, using that that the differences in a negative way, and usually those differences, the things that are being used are incorrect as well, right? They're baseless.
So there's like two levels to that question, which is so
Exactly.
fascinating. It's
Yeah.
a social psychological level of a put down when it comes to things like racism and so forth and all of the isms. And then there is the fact that it's biologically true. And there's two dimensions to that term animal. Very interesting.
Exactly, right. And it's the kind of work that we need to do to understand scientifically who animals are, who we are as animals, and then what that actually means and what relevance that has to any particular question.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, that it helps surface. So this question has helped surface sort of the underlying task ahead of all of us.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes, so thank you for that question. Another question was, where can one find the recording for this session? And so that's on the GW Animal Law YouTube channel. That's one place to find it. Another is on the GW Animal Law, the Animal Legal Education Initiative website under the Animal Law and Science Project. So it's in both of those places. And you can reach out to us and we can let you know if you can't find stuff. So there's another question saying, to follow up, name one non-human species which engages in violence randomly for fun, for revenge, or whatever the human motive might be. And Lori?
Have it. That's a great question. Orcas. I study dolphins and whales. Orcas will sometimes they will play with and kill smaller cetaceans, porpoises, dolphins, for apparently no reason. They may not eat them, but they apparently are doing it for play. And so we're not the only species that engages in violence. Of course, I think we are the most violent, most extreme, and orcas are nowhere near where we are. But this is important, because when I say that, people say, oh, how could you say that about orcas? Because that is the truth of what it is to be a really complex, intelligent, social animal, is that there's things you do that look good and things you do that don't look so great. But the fact is they're all part of your makeup, all part of your nature. And what it shows is that orcas are highly sophisticated beings.
And I think it's also helpful to call into question why we want the answer to these questions, right? And the assumptions that we make. So we make assumptions about humans who engage in violence as well, right? We often denigrate them or stereotype them and don't understand the causes or sources or reasons, right, behind their actions. Sometimes we even determine that something looks violent and it may not in fact have been. And obviously, sometimes it is exactly what it looks like, but trying to back up from the assumptions that we have about the human species and other species, about what behaviors they're engaging in and why, is useful, right? And not going with maybe what we were taught in like kindergarten, right? Which is usually inaccurate.
And also I'd say other animals do not have to conform to what we think is good behavior in order to merit protection. So, their behavior is their behavior. and we shouldn't judge it.
Joe, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Not my area of expertise, but I thought that was a great answer. And I like the idea that it goes both ways, that we can't equate bad human behavior and bad animal behavior, both because it's not fair to humans and because it's not fair to animals to assume that they are all innocent, perfect, idealized. They're as nuanced and complex as humans.
Right. If we give permission, right, for all species, human and other species, to behave as they behave, right, then they can, we won't judge them as harshly, right? We'll give them space to be who they are and understand them better and hopefully relate better. Yeah. Yeah. So we have a couple more questions, and I know we're running at the end of our time. So one is there a resource for reference authors and with published books on animal behavior science? So Joe, I'll let you answer that if you'd like.
To be honest, we don't have a list of books on the Faunalytics website. We cover articles that are on a variety of topics, including some animal behavior science, but we do focus more on social science. So it's something to consider maybe for this group, for having those all in one place for attorneys, or potentially something that our office hours staff might be able to help out with finding, that I can't answer on the call, but that with a little bit of time, we'd be able to help bring together for you.
And I think the Animals in Society website has some of this information, and their newsletters often have wonderful lists that would fit this. And there may be some other, if someone's looking for something in particular, like anthrozoology, right, then there are places to go for that information, for instance. So last two questions, and I know we're over time. So it seems that social scientists can have a role in helping policymakers understand that it is real science. And in particular, natural resources agencies and commissions may not recognize the importance of people's attitudes toward hunting, for example. Yeah. Joe, did you want to respond to that?
I agree. Yes, I do. I completely agree. I could talk for hours about the importance of understanding human behavior and attitudes. I think it's important to note that whether people feel positively or negatively about hunting is not enough to say that hunting should be banned or restricted or regulated. But it is a piece of the puzzle that really matters. And also understanding how those attitudes can be shaped by how people are thinking about animals and our relation to animals.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great example. Yeah, because then you can look at the economics of hunting, you can look at the role that different animals play in the ecosystem, you can look at so many different, you can look at the question from so many different scientific perspectives that really help answer whatever the fundamental question you'd like answered. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
And so the last comment is actually a comment, not a question, which was just sort of saying that we understood the earlier question about violence and Homo sapiens versus other species. So that's wonderful to hear. So given that we are over time, I'll stop us there. Thank you for your attendance and your questions. I want to thank my co-panelists, the wonderful Lori Marino and Joe Anderson. Thank you so very, very much. And this will be recorded, and we'll look forward to seeing you at other events. Thank you.
Be well, everyone.
Bye-bye.